On many, many occasions, we've written to him, like finally, and I know some people find it a little bit too much, but finally, we've have on occasion taken to trying to engage with him directly during his public speaking events. So we tried to communicate. So I've directly asked him, during a question and answer, they said, is there anyone from the audience has a question? And I've stood up and said, will you enter into dialogue with us? We want to solve this problem. And I've offered him a platform. No, obviously I'm not expecting it to happen at that moment, of course, but at least I'm directly speaking to him just to make sure that he is hearing the message. Because sometimes when there's someone with that much power, they have a huge entourage, huge surrounding, and it's difficult to know for sure that your message is getting to them, even if we've written many letters. So at least in that situation, I've spoken to him directly, and I've said, please, will you enter into dialogue? We want to solve this problem. But unfortunately, he was just quite dismissive, and he didn't enter into or even say, okay, look, obviously not here, but let's organize something. He won't enter into dialogue, and that's quite shocking, given his other public statements about the importance of dialogue. We are a Dorje Shugden practicing tradition, and Dorje Shugden practitioners in Tibet, in the exile community, they're our spiritual brothers and sisters, they're our spiritual cousins, and we feel their pain, and also we've seen how it's affected us as well as a tradition. So many of us choose to volunteer to be involved in organizations like the International Shugden Community, and for me, it was just very straightforward. I see this issue very clearly. People are being harmed. There are horrible discrimination. Obviously people will have seen the Al Jazeera documentaries, things like that, the Swiss documentaries, where you see signs in shops saying if you practice Shugden, you're not allowed in. These are horrible things. One of the reasons I've got so involved is I know if we don't stand up for these Shugden Buddhists, no one else is going to. There are many different issues in the world, and people choose their different issues, but no one is standing up for the people who are experiencing this persecution. And so if I don't do it, if people like me who have the freedom to do it don't do it, then no one will do it. Going back to that point about amnesty, Amnesty didn't dismiss it as a non-human rights issue. They wrote a very carefully worded statement saying it doesn't fall within our remit of grave violations of human rights such as torture. They were very specifically not saying that it wasn't a human rights issue. They're just saying it's not within their mandate. I believe, my understanding is that privately they made some fairly strong statements to the Tibetan government in exile. And I know a number of other human rights organizations have done that. The issue is, of course, one thing, unfortunately, is that many people are very compromised in that people have their own material interests, their own political interests, and for the time being associated with the Dalai Lama is very favorable for them. Like a lot of politicians, if they get to be stood next to him, it makes them look good. It makes them look like they're doing something positive. And so a lot of people realize there's an easy way to sort of legitimacy and credibility in terms of positive seeming messages, and so they're taking advantage of that. They're using him, from that point of view, and he's very happy for that because that also gives him a platform to say his message about the politics of Tibet and so forth. And so there's quite a strong vested interest in him maintaining his position, and obviously over the years he's developed a lot of friends and relationships in politics, in the media. Some of that just very genuinely through people believing what he claims to be doing, and some of that is a little bit more sinister. Obviously we're very aware that he was funded by the CIA, and that they of course they infiltrate the media and so forth to make sure the messages that come out are aligned with their interests. So there's a number of different forces, and obviously just human nature. We want there to be a magical person who's wholly good. People really cling to that. That's one of the things that we notice when we're campaigning is some people get extremely angry that we're questioning him. Even though under any normal circumstance, you think, well, everyone in a position of authority should be questioned. You should check whether what they're saying and what they're doing is aligned. And yet some people get very angry that we're even questioning. And I think that shows a very strong attachment. They're clinging to a notion they really want some sort of almost like Santa Claus figure. So we've got we've got political vested interests, we've got the sort of secret behind the scenes stuff, we've got people's attachment to some sort of pure, perfect image. There's a lot of things that are protecting him. But also a lot of that can change. When it does become clear more widely what he's done, and the discrimination, the segregation, it was described as apartheid that he's instigated with his own community. As that comes out, a lot of people will drop him because, that's a abhorrent behavior to be associated with. The Dalai Lama is very much the root of this. Like, if it hadn't been for his speeches, none of this would have happened. If he said tomorrow, actually, I don't want any discrimination, please reverse all these policies, the next day they would be reversed. Like, although he's nominally not in charge, although he's retired from that sense, he is still the power. You know, the Tibetans will, you know, within that Tibetan parliament and so forth, they will not go against his wishes. So what's happening is because they believe it's his wishes. So it would be wonderful if this was not what he wanted, and if he would just say so, then it would stop. They will definitely follow what he says. So the reason we're directing at him is because he's the one with the power to end it. He started it, he can end it, and it's basically all about him. Many of the people in the Tibetan, you know, in the Central Tibetan Administration, many people running the Tibet houses, privately, a number of them have said, like, we don't support this, we don't agree with it, we wish we weren't doing this, it's embarrassing, it's uncomfortable. And in general, like, the Tibetan people are not naturally, you know, racist or aggressive or prejudiced in these kind of ways. If it wasn't for the Dalai Lama's speech making them feel that this is appropriate or right, they would never be doing this, you know? So basically we hold him responsible, and he's the one that created it, he's the one that can solve it. Within the Tibetan community, there's huge social pressure, and anyone being seen or being labeled is in any way against the Dalai Lama would experience huge problems, like, you know, quite possibly violence and many other negative things. And so I think for a long time they were afraid. There were very few that were brave enough to stand up and say. And over time, with the demonstrations, we've given an enormous amount of strength and confidence, and they've seen that the Dalai Lama can't succeed. I think at the beginning they were afraid that they were just going to get wiped out, and if they stood up, they would just be wiped out first of all. And over the years with our protests, we've given the strength for them to realize he can't win this. And so people have the confidence to come out. And another thing, you know, obviously at the beginning, there was this huge shock amongst the Tibetans, and they couldn't really believe that this was happening. And they felt, surely this is a misunderstanding, and if we're just a little bit quiet and we just talk reasonably, then this will all change. So for a long time, I think there were a bit, you know, different groups. Like, some groups were begging us to protest, and some were saying, hold back. Maybe we can solve it. Maybe if we're just a bit quiet and we talk. But then obviously over the years, they've realized all those efforts they made at dialogue were just discarded, and the options were just stop and we will accept you, don't stop and we'll throw you out. And so finally, you know, like, they didn't expect that it was going to get worse and worse and worse. You know, when you got to 2008 and there was the oath campaign saying no spiritual material relations, that's like a complete segregation, that's like apartheid in their community, and they realized at that point, you know, they have no choice. Like, it's either be eliminated from their society or stand up for themselves. So more and more are coming out. Another thing as well was travel papers. You know, like, the demonstrations have predominantly happened in the West. Like, the very first ones were in India, and that was exclusively Tibetans and mostly Tibetan monks. But most of the demonstrations that I've been involved in were in the West. And for those demonstrations, you need travel papers to get there. And for a long time, the Tibetans were struggling to get travel papers. Now more and more are becoming naturalized citizens of Western countries, and that gives them the freedom to protest as well. Some of those first protests, basically, we're all Westerners, except maybe one or two Tibetans. And then we could be easily discredited or disregarded, saying, well, look, these are just Westerners, they're saying this, but there's no Tibetans there. Even though the reasons they weren't Tibetans there were because of discrimination, because they were too afraid to be there, or because they weren't allowed to travel, or a whole range of other things. Nonetheless, people would use that argument to discredit our protests. And obviously that gets harder and harder when you have a situation like today where, you know, we've got hundreds of Tibetans here, and they're standing absolutely at the front, and they want to be seen and they want to be heard, and they're making it very clear we completely support this. Also, obviously, you know, we get lots of messages of support from Tibet, from other places, where people are saying, please carry on, your protests give us strength, your protests are helping us. So yeah, I'm like we very much appreciate the Tibetans standing with us. This year has really marked a sea change in the sense that most of for many of the years, even though there had been documentaries documenting a lot of the facts of the persecution and discrimination, still the feedback from the CTA, from the Dalai Lama's people was, this isn't happening. You know, there is no ban, there is no discrimination, this is entirely made up. And obviously, you know, gradually we've been able to get enough evidence into the public forum that they can't do that anymore. They can't pretend that there is no discrimination. So now there's a chink in their armor and they're saying, okay, there is discrimination, but it's either they're saying it's isolated or they're saying it's okay because of this and this and this. And for me, that's like the classic sequence of how a politician crumbles. You know, like a politician's first point is no, it's absolute denial. And then finally, when they're caught out, they say, okay, actually, no, that's true, but. So at the moment we're in that's true, but. The next step is that the politician is crumbles because it's like they've been exposed. And the CTA can't deny what's happening anymore. They just have to try and justify it. And in doing so, they keep making more mistakes. You know, like publishing the names, faces, photographs, addresses of people who are engaged in peaceful protest who have no criminal record. It's a clear action of intimidation. It's a clear violation of their basic rights. And anyone who's grown up in a climate of democracy understands immediately when they see a government posting a list like that, what a terrible mistake they've made, you know? And then instead of even accepting that and apologizing and taking it down, they go further and say, oh, we had to do that because these people are really violent. It's none of their business. That's a police issue if they're violent. But the fact is, none of these people have convictions for any violent crime. They're completely innocent. No Shugden Buddhist has been convicted ever of a violent crime. So then again, they're lying, lie after lie after lie, and they're just getting tangled up in a web. And eventually it will unravel, and we're getting closer. You can feel that we're getting closer. DorjeShugden.com invited me to do this interview, and I'm very happy to share some of my experiences and some of my opinions.